Alright, so you have your workshop all set up, however messy it may be after a short while, and you've pressure casted your first set of dice, or your 5th, or your 10th. If you're using sprue molds, or if you're using squish molds, you're going to have to do some of this as well. But this, just out of the mold with the large sprue on the end, does not a usable dice make. Plus you have this flashing, which needs just a little bit of care and cleanup. So, how do we turn this into something that you can actually roll and potentially sell online for your dice making addiction and those around you? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, we're picking up immediately where we've left off at the end of the last video. I'm using the clear silicone molds that I made in the Sharp Edge Custom Masters video that released on the channel here a couple weeks ago. Go check that out for everything you need to know to get to the point where you have resin in a mold, you've cast it into a dice, cured it in or not in your pressure pot, and are ready to trim it. Demolding your dice is extremely important, especially on sharp edge molds with very small sprue lines, and especially on something like the D4. Prying apart your silicone molds and having proper cut lines that allow you to overcome any areas where the dice is larger than the sprue or the current available opening for the dice to exit the mold is extremely important. And don't hesitate to put a little bit of pressure on the bottom of the mold to help release the vacuum seal between the resin and the silicone so that you can actually get the mold out. Now, I'm still perfecting my process as far as my resin pours, so out of a 20 dice cast, I usually see 1, potentially 2, that has a small bubble in it that was unable to escape during the pressure pot process, or that didn't get compressed all the way where it's completely invisible. These dice are normally ones I keep for myself, and the rest get sanded and get ready to get sold through loot tables. Now that we have all the dice, you see me re-rubber banding each mold as I'm demolding it immediately after, and this is just a workflow thing I've set up to be able to go from one casting to the next extremely quickly. You don't have to do this, and if you're just getting started, I recommend not doing it and working through one set of dice from beginning to end so you get your idea on the whole process. With the dice out, I use these craft pruning shears, which you can get for about $10 to $12 at your local store or on Amazon, and I'll have an affiliate link to that and everything else down in the description. And the important thing here is to not cut too close to the final die. You can see on this D6 that I leave a good millimeter and a half between my initial cut, where the goal is to just sever the sprue from the edge of the dice. Now we will, over a few cuts, make this a lot closer. But the important thing is never to cut too closely and risk taking off too much material. You can always remove more to make a cut more precise, but you can never add anything back. And once you've crossed that threshold, the entire die is ruined. So it pays to be extremely careful and methodical when doing this. I'll trim up usually within a 0.5 millimeter at the absolute closest before I switch to my second set of tools, which are these X-Acto knives. Now I've sharpened these and I regularly replace these blades. A dull X-Acto knife is about as useful as a butter knife, and blades only cost anywhere from $0.25 to 50 cents, so it's extremely important to replace these regularly. I like to place the die on a piece of wood so I don't risk cutting the silicone mat or my fingers or anything else that's extremely important, and pressing down in a slight direct pull sawing motion, moving from one end of the razor blade to the other, and then resetting the blade and starting over. You don't want to just press, because then you risk compressing the resin and causing an unclean cut, which would cause you to dig into the dice, and we're back to the same problem of if you cut into the die, it's useless. Usually 1 to 2 passes through a single straw sprue is more than enough to cut off the dice. And again, don't hesitate to angle your blade slightly outward from the body of the die and then make another pass. I rotate the die 90 degrees and cut from the same angle if there's any excess currently remaining, but remember to not overdo it. We're also going to sand these, so the cuts don't need to be perfect. They just need to get it down to the point where you don't risk snapping or breaking the corner during sanding. After 1 to 2 passes of the X-Acto knife on each corner, you get something that looks similar to this. About flush, if not just slightly raised from the general body of the die, but very scratched, and it looks somewhat pressurized in a sense from the pressure of the X-Acto knife cutting against it. Now for sanding, it's really just a matter of starting rough and going to finer and finer grits, and then going through different polishing techniques to get the die somewhere really impressive. And this starts with just simple sandpaper. I start with 320 grit sandpaper, making sure to flatten it across my table. Sometimes I tape it down right to the table, but since I was only working on 4 dice for this video, for my main proof of concept, I didn't bother taping it down because that was going to add a lot of extra time. Hold the sandpaper under tension to make sure that it remains flat, and add a little bit of water. Just a small splash of your fingers is about all you'll need. Then take the dice and start with small concentric circles, moving out to larger circles for about 10 to 15 passes. Rotate the die 90 degrees and do the same thing again. And then a personal thing I like to do is to counter rotate in the opposite direction for 10 passes, just to make sure that you're not making circles and you are making random movements. After that, you should see that everything should just about be level. And this is just the first sanding. We have a lot more to go. Rotate the die to the next side that needs to be sanded and repeat the process. Now, once we're finished with a 320 grit sandpaper, it's time for something a little special. This is Micro Mesh, which is a brand name proprietary sandpaper grit system, which uses a slightly different grit rating. They say that 1500 grit in their system is about equivalent to 400 grit of standard sandpaper. Now, normally you'd see that number and think that you would have to go on the standard sandpaper, 320, 400, 600, 800, 1000, 1200, and then start at the 1500 of the Micro Mesh pads. But if you read the instructions, they say to finish to 320 grit on standard sandpaper, and that their 1500 grit is about equivalent to a 400 base grit. And in using this, I found it saves a ton of time, and you don't end up basically redoing work between 320 grit standard sandpaper and then the Micro Mesh system. You take these small papers, tape them down or hold them down the exact same way, add a little bit of water, and then it's the same thing. 10 to 15 cycles on one side, rotate 90 degrees, 10 to 15 cycles, and then counter rotate for another 10. These numbers are completely arbitrary, by the way. It's just what I do, but you should find something that gives you the result that you want and saves you as much time as you can, because you don't want to overdo it, because then you risk throwing the die out of balance. Now, you might be wondering, because you probably looked at more than one channel when it comes to dice making, why I'm using these flat, small sandpaper squares for the Micro Mesh compared to these cushy color-coded pads. These obviously appear higher quality, better made. They're double-sided, which gives you a little bit more surface area to work off of, even though those are slightly larger. I understand that this looks a little cheaper than this. The reason is because these have a bit of a give to them, a bit of a squish, that for a sharp-edged dice could result in a more rounded edge. And if you want to preserve the sharpest of sharp edges with your dice, these pads don't really work. If you're doing your rounded edge dice, they're totally fine, but the price between both options is pretty much comparable. So it really matters in finding the best tool for the dice that you want to make and sticking with that. As always, I have Amazon links down in the description so you can get the tools that I'm featuring here in the video for yourself. And really, now it's just more of the same. Repeat what you've done with each individual Micro Mesh paper from 1500 to 1800 to 2400 to 2800, 32, all the way up to the 12,000. The only thing I do is for the last 2 grits of Micro Mesh, I don't add water. These papers feel far too fine, and I found when I added water, I would get stuck and kick on the paper, and with just a dry sanding for these last 2, it doesn't produce a lot of dust, and it's instead more of just a dry polishing run. From there, we're not done yet. I like to go with Plastex or Flix polish. Right now I've been using Plastex more because the Flix was giving me an odd matte effect with some of the mica powders that I was using. So you take this, you take a big glop of it and throw it onto a microfiber towel. You can use other cloths, but microfiber is going to give you the absolute best result. Get all of the sides, not just the ones you've sanded. Polish the entire die. This will pay off. And just smear a bunch of the polish across the entire dice, being very careful with the smaller dies and on the sharp corners of your dies to not catch it in the cloth and potentially risk breaking it. And then buff it off until all of the polish is off of your resin. At that point, you're going to have a die that is looking amazingly shiny and something that you're going to be proud to use on your own table or to sell online. And really, at the end of the day, that's it. It's just time and patience to turn your raw resin dice, fresh out of the cast and the molds you made yourself, into something that people are gonna consider getting for themselves. Now, if you want to get something that has like the logo on the D6 side face, I will leave a link to the Blue Mimic, who is a 3D printing house who they do 3D printing on demand. They do custom dice masters with your own font, your own logo. And this is not a paid sponsorship. They didn't ask me to shout them out, but I'm just so extremely satisfied with my masters that I wanted to show them some love as well and recommend. And if you do go over there, tell them that Michael from Loot Table sent you, and at least they'll know that I'm showing them a bit of love. But that's it. That's how you make ready, transparent, ready to use dice. For opaque dice like the Red Planet and the Winter's Breath sets that you can pick up on Loot Tables as well, I still go through all of the same amount of sanding, all the way up to 12,000 grit, because you don't want scratches that are perceptible to the human eye. And just because you can't see through the thing doesn't mean that it should be as clear and as shiny as possible. Plus, the Plastex polish just makes things really pop, so it's just time, effort, attention to detail. That's how you get a perfectly sanded dice. I hope this video was useful to you if you're starting your own dice making adventure, or if you're a dice making veteran and just wanted to pick up a new idea from a new place. As always, if you enjoyed this video, a positive rating would be totally appreciated. You can pick up almost all of the things I make on this channel, which are D&D related, over at loottables.com. There's a big sale going on and a big giveaway event for the first 20 days of the year. So make sure to check that out and keep an eye out for some more projects and some more builds here on the channel. Thank you so much. I appreciate all the support. We just recently passed 100 subscribers, which is amazing considering how little this channel has actually done in the terms of producing videos, and how the first 6 months or so were extremely slow. So I just wanted to say thank you, and love and appreciate the support so much. So I hope I'm doing stuff that you all are enjoying. Next week is another woodworking project, as we're going to be making something to hide the secrets of the person running the game. Till next time, I'm Michael. I like to make stuff, and I'll see you around.